In 30 years of life, it's not a long time. 30 years is not very old, but I've seen a lot of changes. I've seen a lot of things come and go. And lately, I've been seeing a lot of things disappear that at one time used to be valuable to people. I've seen businesses disappear. I've seen people disappear, people die. I've seen values go out the window. I'm making this video. This is a more solemn video. So full disclosure, this isn't much of a positive video, although maybe I can get some silver lining in at the end if I think to, but this has been something that's been on my mind. You can see this background here from my computer is very 90s inspired. Really, this aesthetic, I believe, started in the 80s, but it went into the 90s and a little bit into the early 2000s, which would have been my time. But this, to me, is a beautiful aesthetic. I don't know how some other people feel about it, but there's something about it, and it's probably because I'm a product of the 90s that really draws me to it. I saw so many things with these lines and geometric shapes. Anybody remember the Saved by the Bell intro? That sort of thing. But both the 80s and 90s had an aesthetic, and they weren't perfect decades. I want to make this very clear. I don't have nostalgia tinted glasses for the 80s and 90s, mostly because I only remember roughly 96 to 99, because I was born in 92. But the decades had their problems. It's just in the realm of entertainment and the disconnect from the internet. A lot of people have more fond memories, and society was different. There were some worse problems. There were problems that didn't exist because, again, the internet wasn't there. I mean, humanity is humanity. But there seemed to be a collective effort on the part of society to have a general respect for one another, to love one another based on their humanity, not based on what they espouse to be, per se. There was a general respect for your neighbor. You didn't have to like him. You just had to have enough respect to not want to hurt him or to argue with him. And some people did that too. But not everything was a life or death battle in a seemingly endless culture war like we're trapped in right now. This culture war has just made my head spin. Like, everything is political. I look at stuff for kids. What do kids have? I've been doing a lot of reactions to old commercials and talking about old media, and I can tell you I'm so thankful I grew up in the late 90s and 2000s, because the way the culture was, while not perfect, it was so good for kids. It was so healthy for kids. I know some people are going to say, well, it wasn't, there was a lot of junk food promotion and all sorts of other. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the overall feel and behavior that was promoted. It was a freeing time. It felt like you were free to be a kid. You were free of most worry. Some kids obviously couldn't be free of worry because their home life was such a horrible train wreck. There was a lot of divorce in the 80s and 90s. I saw a lot of that, and it did bother me, especially because my parents just loved each other. But I felt bad for the kids who got passed between mom and dad. I remember that concept was so crazy to me. My one neighbor, that's what he did. He went back and forth between his mom and dad. And I wouldn't be surprised if he struggles with that to this day, if that hasn't affected him. But, and like I said, it wasn't all, you know, raindrops and roses. It was, or rainbows and roses, whatever you want to say. It wasn't all good, but a lot of it was better than what we have now. There was a better overall social climate than what we have now, and that's demonstrable. I really do believe it is. And a lot of it does have to do with the lack of social media. And look, people complain about social media all day long, so I don't want to spend too much time harping on it because I like social media. I spent years on social media learning how to use it, making all sorts of great friends that I still have to this day. I think social media is a great tool, and if used responsibly, it can be fine. But it has consumed the lives of adults alike, youth and adults alike. It has consumed people's lives. It's consumed people's time. They spend so much time on their phones. There are all sorts of memes going around about people being in movie theaters on their phone, being at sporting events on their phone, doing everything on their phone, and hardly interacting with the people sitting next to them. And it's depressing. And the younger generation is seeing this, and I feel like they're trying to move away. I have hope for the generation. It seems like they want to do it right, at least some of them, and even some in my generation. But, all this deep dive nostalgia has really made me think that we are in need of a cultural shift badly. We need to get away from the culture war. I don't mean that we need to surrender the culture war, those of us who are proactive in it, but we need to we need to get to a place again where people can have enough respect for one another to leave each other alone. If they're making entertainment, if they're doing whatever it is they do, they don't need somebody breathing down their neck being a moral busybody. There was some of that in the 90s. It came from Christian mothers who were very concerned about the content of the media that their kids were consuming. You know what? God bless them for it. I don't agree with a majority of what they went after. Some of it was legitimate. Some of it was just panic for the sake of panic. Something had a certain aesthetic that they thought was evil, and so they just cut their kids off from it, when in reality it was fine. But there was a concerted effort, despite the fact that it was a bit of a moral panic, there was a concerted effort to be responsible for their kids. Some weren't. Some just went to and complained to companies instead of policing what their kids watched. But my mom didn't do any of that. She policed what I watched. If something was on TV that she didn't like, she turned it off, regardless of how I felt about it. And some people would say, "Well, that's not fair to you." I'm like, "No, it's plenty fair to me. It's her house, it's her TV. I don't pay the bills, you know, or didn't. I pay my bills now, of course, at 30. I pay rent. But back when I was a kid, it was their TV, it was their cable, it was their thing. I was just privileged enough to be able to use it. And while I was under their roof, it was their rules. And I respect my parents for that greatly, and always will. I'm not a parent myself. I'm not really planning on being a parent. But if I was, you guarantee you I would raise my kids the way that me and my sisters were raised, which was very loving, but also not afraid to put their foot down and say no despite protestations. And yeah, we got angry at our parents for doing that, but it made us better people. It made us consider what they were doing. Sometimes they would say no, and we would ask why, and they would do the whole "because I said so." How many people grew up hearing that? I used to despise it, but I understand what it was. What it was they didn't want us to try to get some sort of mental leverage on them. They didn't want us to feel like we could manipulate them because they were the authority. That was the point. They were the authority, and you shouldn't challenge that level of authority unless it's absolutely corrupt. But in their case, it was benevolent authority. It was authority that had our best interests at heart. They didn't want to cause us any harm. They just wanted us to understand core principles. They didn't want us to sacrifice those principles for anything. But today's parents, a lot of them just don't care. A lot of parents back then didn't care too, and I saw how a lot of those kids turned out. They are still a mess as adults. Absolutely, they are horrific mess. Alcoholics, drug addicts, abusers, you name it. They're a mess because they were never told no thoroughly, because their parents had that new philosophy of, "I'm going to be my kid's best friend. I'm not going to put my foot down. I'm not even going to raise my voice at my children." You see that often. Back in the day, if you got in trouble, you'd be spanked in public. You used to see it all the time. Don't see it anymore. And now somebody would call CPS. People say, "Well, why is it good that parents are trying to harm and humiliate their kids in public?" It's like that because it's not the point. The point is that you have consequences for your actions. In the real world, if you start sounding off, yelling at people, hitting people, screaming, things that kids used to do, you would get the cops called and you'd end up in the back of a cop car. And that's that, as an adult. And that's what we were trying to demonstrate to kids. The parents are the cops. And there's such a disdain for authority. That's why you see all these movements to defund the police and all of this, because there's such a growing disdain for authority in our culture. That's one of our problems. Because people see authority as abuse. And some of that is because of what we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s by some genuinely abusive parents. I'm not going to deny that they exist. But the reality is that there were plenty of parents out there who were very loving, but also authoritative, who wanted the best for their kids. Half of the reason we're in the mess we are now is because, sadly, I don't think there were enough. Or there were some, but the kids decided to turn around when they came of age, rebel, and then go against the morals and principles that their parents tried so desperately to instill. I feel sad for a lot of parents having to watch their kids as adults make horrific mistakes in their own families. I feel really bad. I'm proud to say that my parents can look at me and my sister's kids and see how well they turned out, because they were raised by a mother who was she's a lot like my mom in some ways, in really good ways. But the fact is the culture has become so toxic, for lack of a better term. Nobody is really safe from it. You can only stick your head in the sand for so long. Like, there are some people who are like, what is the culture war? What is all this? And I'm like, I somewhat envy you, because it's not on your radar. But it will be in time, because this thing just keeps escalating and going so far outside the realm of the internet. It's going into government and into policy, into companies. You get fired for saying some things that used to be universal truths. You get fired for saying things that used to be common sense, because somebody will be offended. They will take personal offense to what you say. And then a company will haul you into HR and say, well, you need to shape up. You need to go through this program that we have. There was a little bit of that at my last job, but they weren't terrible about it, although some stuff was really stomach churning for me. And ultimately, that's not why I left my last job. It just wasn't a good fit, but it disturbed me what little I saw there, and knowing that at one point this wasn't the case. That the workplace used to be a lot healthier than it is now, and they didn't have to worry about people freaking out because somebody said something they perceived that they shouldn't have. You can't make jokes anymore. You make certain jokes and you get canceled. Cancel culture is ridiculous. And again, already by having said cancel culture, there are going to be people who gaslight and downplay that, but the reality is cancel culture is very real. Look at the whole Me Too movement and what ended up happening. Look at the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. That was an exercise in cancel culture, attempted cancel culture, and it backfired horribly. So there is hope. There is a turning point. I think that the culture is starting to regain slight bits of sanity. Those who had it will never lose it. Those people who stayed sane and grounded in their morals and principles that they've never wavered. I've never wavered. I stay true to biblical principles as a Christian. I'm a Christian first, and then I lean politically conservative second. But I'm more concerned about the Christianity aspect and what the Bible says is right and wrong. That's how I was raised, and that's what I chose to believe at 16. Those were the values that I took upon myself when I had the choice. I could have chosen to reject them wholesale and look at my childhood and think, oh, well, this stuff was just authoritative nonsense, but it wasn't. It was for my benefit, and I understand that now, and I'm eternally grateful to God and my parents for that. But ultimately, our culture is getting worse. If you hold classic morals and principles, believing in a nuclear family, believing in core values, even believing in biblical principles, this world is getting absolutely worse. And biblically speaking, it's supposed to, so there's really no surprise there. But it is discouraging thinking about the youth. It really is. It's discouraging thinking about the next generations. As I get older, and realize how short my time is on this planet, I start thinking about these things quite a bit. Life is way too short to get wrapped up in these things, but these things are more important than people realize. People say, oh, the culture war isn't important. It's very important. It's going to determine people's overall strength. It's going to determine how they deal with life. What we're teaching our kids matters. And right now, they are not being taught core values, at least by the public systems. They're being taught horrific nonsense, and they're being divided amongst each other proactively. They're being divided based on their race, they shouldn't even be talking about their sexuality, but that's what they're talking about. And they're being divided on those lines. They're being divided all over the place. They're being divided from their parents. If they have core principles, they're being told, well, that's wrong, and your parents are wrong. It's all evil what's happening. And there's no question who's behind it. Absolutely Satan. I'm not a conspiratorial person, but I can see Satan's hand at work. So the question is, that's how life was. Will life get better? I think it will. I don't know if we will ever see a mainstream acceptance of certain morality ever again. We might. God might do an absolute miracle. But the reality is, as it stands right now, even though the culture war is definitely shifting, the momentum is shifting back in the direction it seems for the time being that the momentum is starting to shift back into the direction of more traditional values. But I wouldn't rest on your laurels on that. I certainly am not. I'm praying as much as possible for society to return to a live and let live format because it absolutely needs it. Society needs to be able to go back to live and let live. If we don't, we're going to destroy each other. And I've said this multiple times before, but it still rings true. If we don't go back to learning to live and let live, if we can't get along, then we will tear each other apart. We're already at each other's throats. And our kids are going to pay the price. Our kids are going to pay a steep price. Not for environmental stuff. There's some parts of the environment that we need to clean up, and then there's other stuff that is just overly exaggerated for the sake of pushing a specific narrative, for controlling what people can and can't do in specific regards, and imposing a very specific morality onto people, as opposed to talking to people about these things. That's largely what's happening. There's an effort to control people based on fear mongering and not telling people the truth. There's a lot of lies being told to people, and there's concern about lies and misinformation. All these major social media websites are trying to clamp down on quote-unquote misinformation, which means that your average Joe is going to have less and less ability to speak the truth on issues. That's what that means. Regardless of what side of any political spectrum you're on, that's what's coming. Crack down on misinformation. Only the authoritative sources can tell you the truth. Only them. And good luck with that, because they lie to you on a regular basis. They lie to you all the time. Don't ever trust those people. Hold them to a standard of truth, and if they don't, reject them wholesale. That's what I say. If the government isn't being truthful, then don't trust it. If the people who you are supposed to trust can't be trusted, if they won't tell you the truth, if they won't be transparent with you because they're afraid of losing power, losing control, losing whatever it is, then don't give them 5 minutes. Same with CNN, same with MSNBC, same with Fox News, same with ABC News, same with CBS News. Don't trust any of these news sources until they tell you the truth, and hold them to a standard of truth. Many of these news networks are already going down the toilet because they won't tell the truth, and they're freaking out. And that's why they don't want people like you and I talking about issues. They want to police them. They want to police what you say because they don't want you saying something that might be untrue and causing people to act on misinformation. If somebody acts on false information, that's on the individual. I won't act on something if I don't know the full details, if I don't go to multiple sources. And rarely ever will I act on something in a way that these people are afraid of. But they're deathly afraid of people acting and doing something horrible or violent based on misinformation. That's their justification. We've got to curb violence because people are getting angry because they're being lied to and they're lashing out and violent. No, not everybody is. A couple people do from time to time, and that's with any side of a political or ideological spectrum. People sometimes go off the handle. That's human. That's humanity. That's human nature. That's human sin nature. There is not a thing, not an idea, nothing you can do can really curb that other than tell people not to act. Teach kids not to act on emotion. When you act on emotion, that's when that sort of thing happens. If you don't act on emotion, if you're measured, you can be upset, but don't do something out of anger or extreme sadness. Don't let those things be your guiding post. But right now, that's all there is. Social media is filled with people who are looking for the next big outrage. They're proactively looking for it, and they're running in cancel culture packs and going and tearing into people and having arguments with people they've never met for hours on end for no reason. They're wasting the precious time that they have on this earth just arguing with people back and forth. It's a waste. And we need to get away from that. And thankfully, it looks like we are. Less and less people are starting to use things like Twitter despite all of the changes. And more different alternatives are popping up. And There's positivity. There is a shift taking place, but if there's not a push to go back to a semblance of basic human decency, respect, then it's all going to fall apart. And we need to know that. We need to understand that. If we don't understand that, then we're headed towards a dark place. I remember how life was. Many people do. It's not an illusion. It's not something you can gaslight people out of. You can't just say, oh, you've just got nostalgia glasses on. No, that's not an honest assessment of somebody's genuine memories. People who are alive in a time where things like cancel culture weren't the fear, at least in the form that cancel culture has taken now, they remember how it was. When there was a moral panic with Christian mothers, a lot of people just ignored it, and what ended up happening? Nothing. Nowadays, there's a moral panic, and every company has to bend a knee. They have to take a side in a conflict that they should be taking no sides on. They should just be providing entertainment, products, whatever it is they do. But now companies have to take a stance on political issues, inherently political issues. They shouldn't have to. They really shouldn't. Because they're just telling people, we don't want your money if you don't agree with us. We don't want your business. We don't care about our business. We only care about espousing principles, even though that's why nobody goes to us. People go to you for your products, for your entertainment. Same with actors. Actors always running their mouth off about their progressive causes, but the reality is nobody outside of their circles care. General, average, everyday people don't care. They don't read tabloids. They don't watch interviews. They just watch a movie or a TV show and are hopefully entertained by it. But now they have to preach about how the world is dying, how we need more equity, we need more diversity, we need more inclusion. Things that were naturally occurring before. But they're preaching about how there's a crisis. It's not a crisis. If anything, it's a manufactured crisis. The diversity, equity, and inclusion movement is not based off of anything really organic. If this movement was started in the 1950s, it would have made sense. But starting it now, it makes no sense whatsoever. We live in one of the most prosperous societies in human history in America. People have the opportunity, regardless of their race and gender, to do multiple things. There's very few limits to what a person can do in this country. But yet there are people screaming from their rooftops that no, you're not seeing the hidden inequity, the hidden oppression. You need to be awakened to it. That's where woke comes from. People who are awakened to these so-called injustices. And many of them aren't. Sometimes they will take ones that are legitimate and they will overplay them. That's how this stuff becomes divisive. Because they take a principle that people can generally agree with and they blow it out of proportion. And they make it a social crusade. That's why they're called social justice warriors. It's a crusade against injustice. But a lot of injustices are perceived. Many are based on past injustices that have genuinely been fixed. But they won't be truthful to you about that fact. Look at black representation on television. There's not enough black representation on television. What do you mean? Family Matters, The Jeffersons, Different Strokes, Perfect Strangers, Hanging with Mr. Cooper, even modern stuff, That's So Raven, the original Proud Family, the good one. Corey in the House on Disney Channel. All of BET. What the heck are you talking about? Sports, films, guys like Denzel Washington being one of the greatest actors of our time. Why are they lying? They're lying because they want to push an agenda. They're not concerned about people's genuine representation, not that it matters as much. Representation used to be organic. People wouldn't bring attention to it. People were just, they liked good acting. If there's a black family on television that was relatable, then everybody loved them. Everybody loved the Winslows and Urkel. Everybody loved the, I don't remember what the family's name was on That So Raven, but most people watched it, loved that family. The Baxters, that's what it was. People loved the family from Sister Sister. They didn't care that they were black. The Cosby Family, The Cosby Show was considered one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. And yes, I know it's a little tainted now because Bill Cosby's so controversial. And I won't get into my thoughts on that, but People have the nerve in the 21st century, or the ignorance, to say that black people are underrepresented in television and movies. What do you mean? You're ignoring 30, almost 40 years at this point of history, possibly more, just so you can push a victimhood mentality. Get that garbage out of here. I'm tired of it. If you don't know how life was, then don't talk about it. Don't act like there's not enough. There may not be enough of the type of representation that you specifically want, but there has always been, in some form, that representation. Maybe not always, that's the wrong way to put it, but there has been, for many years, good, honest representation of minority groups, if that's what's so important to you. It's not important to me. I think whoever is good at acting should get that position. But no, now they have to race swap characters because that's not divisive. You can't identify with somebody that doesn't look just like you or the way that you think they should look. It's evil. It's just divide, 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 divide. I'm tired of dividing. I'm tired of people just blatantly being divisive and lying. Like I said, people will literally say there's not enough black representation on television and ignore 40 years of it. They will ignore it, or they will downplay it and say, well, it wasn't that impactful. What are you talking about? Steve Urkel is still quoted to this day, and that's one example. Again, the Cosby Show is referenced, less so now, but it was referenced all throughout the 2000s. It was rerun. All these things were rerun. And people loved it. People of all stripes who watched it. The lies, man. I hate the lies. That's one thing about culture, is the lies for the sake of a movement that is inauthentic. It needs to stop. Like, I'm getting angry thinking about this. I want to enjoy entertainment again. But Hollywood doesn't want to entertain me. People like me are old relics, according to them. We're intolerant. That's why I say screw Hollywood as it stands. I hope it burns to the ground, not literally, but I hope the entire industry fails and can be rebuilt into something resembling what it once was, where people can enjoy entertainment and not be offended. They can feel perfectly represented. They can feel however they need to feel about it. And we don't need to have these constant battles. That's my thoughts on this, folks. Thank you very much for watching. I miss the good old days. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.